Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest from Paris is Nicolas Tenzer. He is a scientist and author. He's a guest professor at Sciences Po School. He is a senior fellow at CEPA Center for European Policy Analysis, and he is an author of his blog, Tenzer Strategics. Welcome, and thank you for having found time for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My first question to you is, we have all the debates since months. Who should be the leading political power in Europe in regard of the Russian war of Ukraine? Should it be the United States? Should it be the European Union, Germany, France, the United Kingdom? Who should be the leading force of the free world? Do we have one?
I think that's a true question because basically I would say both of them. Basically, I mean, the free world has to remain united. And I think that any kind of distance between the US, the UK, France, Germany, and others, I mean, will be certainly more incentive given to Russia and China as well, basically to destroy the rule-based orders. So I think that any kind of difference between those powers could be exploited by our enemies. Having said that, I think we have many different kind of issues. We have the issue, of course, of the alliance itself. And we perfectly know that the alliance that it is now, especially regarding to the Article 5, cannot function without the US, because the US is the most important guarantee provider to the NATO countries, especially Eastern and Central European countries, of course. And we perfectly know as well that without the US, Ukraine wouldn't exist anymore. That's because of the huge amount of delivery of weapons given by the US that Ukraine is still able to survive. And from this point of view, I think that all the EU countries did, of course, a lot. They sent a lot of weapons, ammunition, etc., and also financial aid, and that's very good. But certainly they cannot. They are not still able to replace the US. So we have a question for the long term, because if the US abstain, I think the European countries should also be able to take the lead. Let's take an example, which is the example of 2013. We perfectly know that at that time, President Obama of the US decided not to enforce the red lines after the chemical attacks on the Ghouta. And so basically, my president, François Hollande at that time, was ready to fight and to launch strikes on serious military headquarters. But alone, France could not do, and he has absolutely no support, neither for the UK, because the House of Commons at that time blocked, neither for the other European allies. And let's imagine that we have another president in the US, and I think that's a true fear. I hope that's not a prophecy, but we do not know right now. I think the EU must be able also to defend, to protect the other EU countries or the European countries as a whole, namely Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Belarus, and some others. So we have actually a very concrete debate about the reinforcements of the EU capabilities if one day the US is not able or mostly not willing to take action accordingly.
That is exactly the dilemma you have mentioned right now. You have already elaborated on it pretty deep on your Twitter account, comparing the situation now in Ukraine with Russia's war against Ukraine with the situation in Syria with the usage of chemical weapons back then. And you criticized also the slow response of the US President Joe Biden with the delays of delivery of certain weapons, with the rejection of sending F-16 jets to Ukraine or long-range missiles to Ukraine. And you also pulled a certain line between the Obama administration, where Joe Biden was vice president back then, and Joe Biden's administration. Can we say that now the US, which absolutely right, which provided Ukraine with a lot of support early months of this invasion, but still, can we say that the US is now about to repeat the same mistake it has done years ago in Syria?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, that's not exactly the same situations because, I mean, the Syrian people received absolutely no aid, concretely. Some weapons from some groups, but I mean, certainly not enough. And right now, of course, as I said before, of course, the US and other allies send a lot of weapons to Ukraine, and that's good. And they are ready, and we have the decision taken just very recently by President Biden to send all the evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. And that's good, of course. But I do not understand why the US seems so afraid to finish the job. Because basically, if we want to save Ukrainian lives, we have to send to Ukraine all the weapons it needs, including the ones that you mentioned. We have basically to step in dramatically because I think that's really a question of life or death from Ukrainian people. But that's also a question of strategy. I think in the long run, we have to consider that we have to defeat Russia. We don't have only to defeat Russia basically in Ukraine, and that's certainly the first priority, but we have also to defeat Russia in Georgia, in Moldova, in Belarus. We must get rid of the dictator Lukashenko in Belarus. We have also to continue defeating and to step in also in Syria, because we perfectly know that we have there an alliance between Iran and Russia with Assad's regimes. We have also to defeat Russia. Let's take other examples in Africa. We had recently a coup in Niger. We had some coup in Mali. We have also the Russian troops or Wagner troops, but that's quite the same. In fact, you know, in many African countries, we have also some kind of military assistance also to other countries like Venezuela, for instance, and to Myanmar. So that's basically two other continents. And I think we have really to finish the job. And I think we have to be fully consistent. And that what I do not understand is when I'm in the White House right now, doesn't want, and seems to be afraid of something, afraid of defeating Russia, afraid of a kind of a vacuum at the very center of Europe or something like this. But I think that's really misleading to understand it. And then we have, I mean, all those very old, narrative spreading out, not only in the US, but also sometimes in France, in Germany, in the UK, and other European countries, according to which Putin could be a kind of stabilizer, you know, in the very center of Europe. And I think they're completely mad. I mean, the idea is that Putin's regime could offer a kind of stability and that there could be something worse than Putin with the guys that killed basically hundreds of thousands of people. I think this idea, is basically nonsense. I think we have this kind of narrative, which is kind of, let's say, well, we have to arrange something with great powers. That's I think the old remnants of what we call the great powers politic, framed by Mearsheimer and others, which is completely mad. I think the countries like Ukraine, not only in fact is a great power, but can contribute much more than others to European security and to the security of the world than, of course, Russia. And I think that we have also to understand that there is a kind of snowball effect. If Russia is not fully defeated in Ukraine, it will basically continue to harm our security and also to take the lives of so many people around the world. That's why I think we must have these long pictures. And what it seems to me is that we don't have either the White House or, in France or the UK, Germany, etc. We don't have the long-term vision about the future of Russia, nor about the future of Ukraine. And there is very short-termist visions of, well, we have to basically to help Ukraine, to incrementalize the help to Ukraine, but we still consider that there must be a kind of Russia with which we have to deal with. But the very idea that we could have to deal with Russia one way or another is completely contradictory to the requirement uttered by those leaders that we have to punish all war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggressions, and genocide. I mean, that's completely inconsistent, because if we say, well, we have to one day or other to have some of peace talks or negotiation with Russia, it contradicts also the idea that Russia has to pay also war damages, should be fully accountable, etc., etc.
That is amazing, like the insight and the clarity which you provide in your statement. Before we go further to questions how to deal with Russia in a way that provide more peace and stability and not increase the risks in the world, Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to like, to share, to leave your comments, and wait for the new interviews, because when you subscribe, you get informed about new interviews like this, and you are the first one who will watch them. But back to your statement regarding the lack of understanding of the risks. Like we have seen in the last months, the voices not only from Germany or the US, but also from other countries, maybe of all countries except of Ukraine, which said that if Kremlin fails, if Russia is being defeated, then the level of chaos will increase, and we don't know what will happen next. We don't know how much dangers will appear in the world, and that is extremely similar to what we experienced before the collapse of the Soviet Union. As many people in the West, including the US President George Bush, were afraid of the collapse of the Soviet Union because they believed that the chaos will be unleashed. But that hasn't happened. Like most countries which appeared after the collapse of the Soviet Union are democracies, or at least not as dangerous as the Soviet Union used to be. So what prevents the politicians in the West now from seeing Vladimir Putin as a threat for the world, a person who sparks the unrest and wars worldwide? You named Venezuela, Syria, Central Africa. What prevents them to see that the collapse of Russia would make the world a better place?
Well, I think first of all we have to consider that we have what I labeled, soft propaganda narratives are basically spreading out, also in governmental spheres. Certainly unwillingly. I mean, most of the people are not conscious that they are basically reproducing basically those kind of narratives. But I am studying those narratives since years, and I can say that the idea of chaos, the idea as well of World War III, of nuclear war, this idea of, well, there could be worse than Putin, and that Putin could be at least a kind of form of stability, as I said before. I mean, those are basically Kremlin's narratives. And what I am really afraid of is the easiness with which all those narratives are basically bought by some of the Western leaders. For instance, my president, Emmanuel Macron, was spreading this kind of narratives before. Fortunately, no, probably he understands quite well, the truth about those narratives. But before, for instance, he was talking about, security guarantees for Russia, as if Russia was really threatened by anyone. I mean, which is completely mad. So you have this kind of narrative, and so the people, I mean, in the White House or German Chancellery and other places, still considers that the risk of chaos could be something, I mean, that could be worse than anything else. And
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but when I try to imagine what could be worse compared to what Russia did already, like blowing up the Kakhovka dam and releasing the water amount 5 times bigger than the Lake Constance, installing mines on the Europe's largest nuclear power plant, having killed about like 300,000 of people in Ukraine, including over 100,000 of own troops. What could be worse?
I think, of course, we can imagine worse. We could imagine as a kind of basically nuclear apocalypse, etc. And of course, Russia is playing on this kind of narratives, which seems to me very unlikely. Of course, we have to monitor, and we have, of course, the military intelligence that is doing that perfectly to monitor the risk, certainly. We must not be naive. We have to be cautious, etc., etc. But I think that this kind of risk is very low. And the problem is that we have a lot of leaders also that consider the short-term risk as more important than the long-term risk. And the long-term risk with Russia is certainly more important if Putin is staying at power. Just imagine the kind of world we will have if, let's say, Putin is just half defeated in Ukraine. Half defeated, I mean, okay, we have the withdrawal of some troops, but still, we have the control of some part of Ukraine by Russia, which means basically more forced disappearances, torture, deportation of children, of people, etc., etc., which means also that Putin will be emboldened will save his face and could sell also its own propaganda to, let's say, African countries, for instance. I mean, that will be a catastrophe for the world. So that's basically the long-term risk that we have. And I think we must not focus on the short-term risk that some still are envisioning. Then you have, I mean, the whole idea that I studied about, because I think that we have really to watch very carefully the narratives, which is the old narrative of the so-called realist, the pseudo-realist. That was the expression was framed by Raymond Aron 60 years ago. The pseudo-realists, which are not realist at all, in fact, who are always talking about stability. And when word was framed, not by Aron, but by someone else, which is the word stabilocracy. And that's also is the temptations of many Western leaders to consider that there are some stable powers, not only Russia, I mean, but could be also some strong men, in the Middle East or in Africa, etc. And I mean, the catastrophe would be to have some revolutions. I mean, that's why they were not those persons, very, I will say, prompt to support also the Arab Spring movement, in many countries. And in fact, it's completely wrong, since we see also that those Middle Eastern countries, at the end of the day, are basically causing up to Putin as well. Let's consider, for instance, the Emirates, and the Emirates basically reopened the door to Assad, to the Arab League. And so for Egypt, and Egypt, has very ambiguous positions with Russia, as we know, etc. We can give many, many examples. And for me, I mean, that's a source of concern, which is that many guys are, in power, are still, embedded in the narrative of the old geopolitics. The so-called realist, narratives, and we have some figure right now like still Mearsheimer's and some others, Kissinger had changed a little bit his mind, not fully in my view, but I mean, you have some people more reasonable than others who consider that to be realist is basically to understand the true dangers and the main dangers, because we cannot be realist if we are not facing the dangers, tackling the dangers, addressing them on a strong, very strong way, and considering that the fait accompli, should prevail. Basically, is not to be realist, it's to be defeatist.
That is exactly what many in Ukraine are saying, that the only realistic way out of this war is Russia's defeat in Ukraine, because a half defeat, as you already mentioned, will just encourage not only Russia, but also other dictatorships to check the limits of what is allowed to them, what they can reach, and how they can blackmail us. But coming back to your statement about the development of the French position, we have seen in the beginning of this war the attempts of French President Macron to have phone talks to Vladimir Putin, to visit Putin in Kremlin, and to find some ways out of this back then pre-war tension in some sort of diplomacy and assurance to Vladimir Putin. Then it was France who was one of the first nations which delivered artillery like Caesar howitzers to Ukraine, and then it was France which first out of Western nations announced delivery of tanks to Ukraine, which many things in Germany also pushed the German Chancellor Scholz to a decision to provide Ukraine with a Leopard 2 tanks. What is the role of France now? Can France provide now more support for Ukraine and be a leading power in Europe, or is the limit of French influence is already exhausted?
Well, I would say two things. I think, first of all, there is a true U-turn by Emmanuel Macron, in the war. Just listen to his speech, on May 31st in Bratislava, in Globsec Forum. I was in the room, and it was very impressive to attend the speech, because basically Emmanuel Macron recognized the failures of his predecessors and his own. Let's say, for instance, he criticized very much the Bucharest, summit in 2008, with the oppositions to membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia at that time. He criticized very much the fact that we were not listening to the Central and European countries that warn us since a very long time about Putin. and he said very clearly that we have to provide, security guarantees, concrete ones to Ukraine. And certainly, in Vilnius summit on July 11 and 12, he was very supportive to Ukraine's applications to NATO, even if he probably considers that we should not give it right now, immediately. But he was certainly against all the conditions that at the end of the day were put to the membership of Ukraine, a new decision by the member state, and some conditions or obligations which remained very vague. And he was certainly very frustrated. But the first day of the Vilnius summit, you remember, he announced that France will deliver Scalp, which are long-range missiles, 500 kilometers reach, to Ukraine, which was also a way, after, of course, the UK's decisions, also to put more pressure on Biden on the delivery on long-range missiles to Ukraine. The second thing is that France certainly understands, and Macron basically understands two things. First of all, is that he wants to lead basically the EU and to appear as a true EU leaders. He have to side with Ukraine more actively to take a very tough stance on Russia, because he understands that his credibility was very severely undermined by all his attempts to have a new kind of relationship or new reset, or he was speaking of new architecture of security and trust, that was 2019, with Russia. He now perfectly understands that it was completely misleading if he wants to achieve his personal goal to be a true leader of Europe. The second thing
So now he needs to prove himself as a person who has understood his mistakes, his failures,
yes,
and tries to repay them.
exactly. And he also understands, because that's part of his long-term project, which is to create more, let's say, strategic autonomy of Europe, or more, defense capabilities within the EU. He considers that it is very important to distance himself also from the US. And if the US appears to be weak, then France needs to be strong, and maybe stronger than the US. And he perfectly aware that something that he explicitly said, in Bratislava, that we do not know what will happen in 2024 with the US elections. And that's certainly a challenge for France, that's a challenge for Europe as well. And certainly right now, we perfectly know, that's not a secret, that the relationships are not fully, I will say, fully good with Chancellor Scholz. So certainly he understands also that he has to distance a little bit with Germany, and that a lot of countries in Europe, especially the Nordic countries and Central European countries, certainly do not want to have a kind of France-German condominium, or private circles leading Europe. Certainly, basically the history, is not in favor of this kind of solution. So he understands that he certainly has also to find new ways to extend his dialogues and also trust and confidence with countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Sweden, Finland, etc. And I think that's very instrumental in Macron's view, and certainly understands that very well.
Well, that is amazing what you're describing, and we'll definitely come to this topic of French Central European alliance, or chances of such alliance. But before we do it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, to like, to share, and to leave your comments in the commentary section. What you have mentioned, this idea of strategic autonomy, which French President Macron has pushed many times, and this independence of Europe, or more freedom of Europe to decide independently on its security challenges and other needs. This was seen by many in Europe as a threat to European security, like saying Europe is not capable to protect itself militarily. That's why a decoupling from the US would not increase the European ability to act, but after all, decrease it, and will push Europe to hands of China, or maybe even Russia. as Europe would be weaker without the US military support. But now with weaker US, with a risk that Donald Trump can be re-elected in 2024, who knows, this idea doesn't look that risky anymore, or does it still?
I think that certainly, I mean, that this idea was not very clear in Macron's mind at its very beginning, to be clear, and it was not clearly explained. In my view, there are some things that strategic autonomy must not be. It must not be decoupling with the US, as you rightly said. It must not be the attempt for the EU to replace the kind of guarantees provided by NATO Article 5, certainly not. And I think it was very interesting to see that Macron was clear, you know, in his speech in Bratislava about that. We need NATO, he said, we need NATO. And certainly, I mean, the EU cannot replace NATO. Probably it was important for him to say this because at the beginning, hence, I mean, the distrust that the idea created, it was absolutely not that clear. So basically, we can understand that there could be in NATO two kinds of pillars. There is, of course, there could be the European pillar. And the European pillar is basically, in terms of strategic autonomy, the ability for the UE to act, especially if the US doesn't want to. That was the example that I mentioned, Syria, yeah. Or let's say if Ukraine was not supported by the US, it could be other countries as well. And I think from this point of view, strategic autonomy means, of course, more defense spending, certainly more than the 2% of the GDP for defense spending in most of the EU countries, and certainly modernizing. There must be more also procurement, you know, in common. There could be a privilege given in Macron's mind also to basically the EU fabricated weapons. And we must also try also to be, I would say, self-sufficient in terms of weapons and not only to rely on US or Israel technologies. And I think from this point of view, that's also very important also to have, I mean, this ability, industrial capabilities in Europe. I know it's difficult, it will take years or decades mostly, but we must have this idea. But when it comes to basically the Article 5 guarantees, then US is absolutely the indispensable nation. But of course, we know that there is a risk if Trump, let's say, comes to power. And I saw very recently, I had a look at the platform of the Republicans, I mean, the Trump's Republicans, which are not, of course, all the Republicans in the US, but Trump's Republicans, they have the idea basically to distance themselves from the EU. Maybe to decree, as Trump said already, that NATO is obsolete and this kind of thing. And that will be a true danger. But certainly from this point of view, the strategic autonomy has absolutely no meaning because that's just impossible. I remember some talks that I had with very senior officials, you know, in France, who tell me that if we want to replace the kind of guarantees provided by NATO, then we will have to increase the defense spending to 6 or 7% of the GDP. And certainly, I mean, the public opinion of most of the European countries won't follow on that. Certainly, given, I mean, all the other expenses that we have to make for social security, hospital, policemen, justice, etc. I mean, so that's, I think, a true issue that we certainly have to face and to address right now. What the kind of defense that we want, how to articulate the European defense with NATO. I was speaking about, you know, a kind of European pillar that does not concern the Article 5. So we have to think about the new European architectures. And just let add one point. I think that this new architecture, Ukraine will be absolutely a fantastic asset as well.
That is exactly the question I wanted to ask you. If we are talking about the military pillar, European military pillar of NATO, how can Ukraine be integrated into this military pillar of NATO without being a NATO member yet?
I think that I mean, from a legal point of view, we can imagine everything. I mean, the law is flexible. Of course, I am very much supporting, you know, the Ukraine's application to NATO since a very long time. I mean, even before, 24th of February 2022. Of course, that's, I think we should have done, and I criticize very much, the mistakes that France and Germany did in 2008 in Bucharest, certainly. So I think I am supportive of that. But still, no, I think that we can and we must, in a way, integrate Ukraine to any kind of, I will say, framework, networks that could be used. But I will go even further. I think that right now, because we are talking about security guarantees, but I was very disappointed, by the Vilnius summit. I wrote 2 pieces on that. I was in the room because I was one of the speakers at NATO Public Forum at the same time. So I was in Vilnius there with discussion with a lot of the leaders there. There was a kind of real frustration among some of the leaders and the experts as well. But I think, no, we have to think about the security guarantee. What I am suggesting since months is basically also to send NATO or EU troops, depending on the umbrella, but we could choose as well not only NATO umbrella, but EU umbrella plus the UK, let's say, to send, those troops in the liberated part of Ukraine. That could be something very important. And then, of course, they could also, we could enjoy, also all the experience accumulated by the Ukrainian forces. Of course, I am not suggesting right now, even if I was suggesting on February 24th, also to take action directly, in Ukraine, that those troops could participate to the fight against Russia. I think that very unfortunately that won't be accepted by most of the NATO countries. But still, if we could have also some boots on the ground, I think that will be a true deterrence for Russia, because I think that Russia wouldn't dare to attack the NATO troops there. The only point is that I think that the US that doesn't want to be truly, I would say, engaged in this kind of conflict, or what they call, that was Sullivan's words, the NATO-Russia war, will certainly dissuade all the allies to send troops in Ukraine. That's a true issue. But still, I am pushing very much this idea.
That is exactly what many in Ukraine are saying, that any sort of integration of Ukraine into NATO up to full membership will not be an escalating factor, but quite the opposite, de-escalating factor, because Russia clearly knows its limits and knows where they may push and where they may not, and they would not dare to do anything against the NATO. So that would be a de-escalating factor. But if we are looking one step further and imagine a military defeat of Russia in Ukraine, which I hope will happen soon, what will happen next? We know that many Western countries are not ready to plan something with the collapse of Kremlin, collapse of Vladimir Putin's power, but it can happen, and it most probably will happen without a consent from the West. What should be our steps to prepare our countries and ourselves for this military defeat of Russia? How could we stabilize the situation after that?
I think there are 2 things, and I wrote, a long piece in 2 parts about, the future of Russia and how we have to manage it. In my view, that tremendously vital and crucial for the decades to come, not only the next year to come, but the decades to come. First of all, we have certainly to ensure that the Kremlin is fully defeated, as I said, not only in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, but also in Moldova, but also, in Syria. We must also push for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Belarus and have free and fair elections there. That's absolutely vital for this country, which is led now by a bloody dictators with more than 1,500 political prisoners in jails who are suffering tortures, some executions, and something which is absolutely awful as well. And I think we have, of course, we must have Belarus in our mind. That's very important. So we have, first of all, to really finish the job. And I think that if we have a kind of military collapse of Russia in Ukraine, that will follow. But then we have to monitor the situation. That's the first. The second is that we must be absolutely firm on, first of all, the continuations of sanctions. we must not lift the sanctions, even if Putin is no more in power, that you have, I mean, other Putin's cronies, basically, because I don't think that the liberal opposition will come to power immediately. I mean, that's a very, very much unlikely, of course. We have to keep the sanctions intact. Until what? First of all, the payment, full payment of war damages to Ukraine. Second, I mean, all the criminals, not only Putin's, Lavrov, Shoigu, and Simonian, Solovyev, others, military generals, of course, should be sent to the international tribunals, either, of course, could be the International Criminal Court, but some other tribunals, because the ICC cannot judge everyone. Or could be also some tribunals in Ukraine for, I would say, classical war criminals, if I may say so. So, I mean, that's absolutely a requirement. Then we cannot slip the sanctions. Third, we must have, I mean, all the children deported, in Russia, and of course, sometimes their parents, families, who must basically come back. And then, of course, Ukraine immediately must join NATO and be provided full security guarantees by NATO members. And then I think we should have NATO troops basically on Ukraine soils, if, of course, the Ukrainian government wish. I think that's absolutely important. Then we have to manage the transition. And transitions means different kind of things. First of all, I mean, I will say there must be a full demilitarization of the Russian society. And that's part of the pressure that we should exert. We have to rewrite the textbooks about, let's say, World War II, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalinism, etc. And as one of my very dear Ukrainian friend once said, Anna Opko, she said, Russia will be free when we will have two memorials, on the Red Square, one to the victim of Stalinism and the other one to the victim of Putinism. And of course, that will take decades. And then in terms of assistance, because sometimes, after everything is done, the payment of war damage, we certainly will have to assist in a way Russia. I'm not saying lifting sanctions, but assist Russia. I think, there must be more conditionality. First of all, we have to turn to the poor people and to the average Russian people. What was not done after 1991? After 1991, we had a kind of, let's say, Keynesianism for the rich, and we were inspired by the lessons of the Milton Friedman, the ultra-liberal for the poor, which means, we had absolutely no chance for the poor just to survive and to also have access to social security, housing, schools, etc. And for the rich, because of our own greed, it was a very favorable situation that enhanced corruptions. And I think so we have also to think about the long-term also economical receipt for Russia. We have to frame that. We have also to design this kind of future. And I think that countries like, of course, the US, France, UK, etc., should have a kind of vision about how in the long run, because it will take years and decades, we have to manage Russia's future. And of course, we have to support the liberal oppositions. We have to do all these kind of things. But first of all, the immediate task is not Russia. Let's be very clear on that. The first task right now is Ukraine and to reconstruct Ukraine after Ukraine's victory.
That is absolutely clear worlds and the vision of a future which could really be a stable future. Demilitarized Russia, which has repaid the debts and is on the way to democratization and to rethinking its own history and its own past, and a massive support for Ukraine in reconstruction after the old destructions which Ukraine has suffered during the Russia-inflicted war. Thank you so much. It was an amazing interview with Nicolas Tenzer. He's a guest professor at Sciences Po, he's a senior fellow at CEPA, and he is an author of his blog, Tenzer Strategics. Thank you so much for having been with us today from Paris, and I'm pretty sure we will make another interview with you amidst the development of the situation, also not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia. Thank you so much. And don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share, and stay with us.
Thank you, Sergej.